Either Facebook and YouTube Live. And if you're checking this out for the first time, this live stream is to support and serve the needs of nurse educators in the trenches, such as you, with practical strategies to, again, better prepare our students for professional practice and a successful career in nursing. If we haven't met, my name is Keith. I'm the founder of KeithRN. And as KeithRN has been in the marketplace for about 12 years, serving the needs of nurse educators. And, we're going to kind of go into my story a little bit later in this live stream, but really my passion is to serve and to shepherd the needs of nurse educators to, again, create a culture of preparing our graduates for practice and addressing the current challenges, keeping it real. No topic is going to be off limits in our conversation tonight as we talk about the importance of bridging the academic practice gap. And, the mission of KeithRN is really to transform how nursing is taught one educator at a time. And every one of you listening to this live stream is part of the needed change and it can be part of the solution that is desperately needed in nursing education. And so those of you that are attending live, we're going to have a conversation here, and I would love to know who's here tonight. So if you're joining us, just put your name in the chat, first name, let us know where you're coming from, and want to welcome you. And thank you again for joining us tonight. So I know there's a little bit of a gap there, but I'll keep my chat open. And I just want you to know that, yes, tonight's topic is probably one of the most, every topic we discuss is important. Kind of like sermons. Every sermon is needed, but there are some that kind of rise to the top saying, this is really, really important. And this is something that, as we talk about bridging the academic practice gap, bringing, kind of what is the gap? Let's talk about that. But then how do we bridge it? So our graduates don't just pass the NCLEX, but they are prepared, at least at an entry level. They have the competence and the clinical judgment skills at a foundational entry-level expectation to provide safe patient care. Because in nursing education, we must never lose sight that graduates who are not well prepared adversely impact patient outcomes, and that leads to literally dead patients. And that's never okay. And so we need to just kind of recognize the seriousness of tonight's topic as we talk about practical strategies to bridge the academic practice gap and what that looks like. And so I want to welcome you, Debbie from Connecticut, Kim from Alberta, Canada. Great to have a Canadian with us. Kim from Rock Island, Illinois, and Tim and Rob and Jeanette. So welcome here tonight. I just want to kind of throw in the chat that we do these live streams every month to serve your needs. And last month's topic was on developing clinical judgment, best practices to assess clinical judgment with Dr. Shelley Bassard and Lisa Gonzalez. We had a crucial conversation with Redonda Bott a couple months ago, the nurse who made the medication error that unfortunately led to a patient death, in her story that is really relevant to every nurse educator. So those Facebook Lives, they're about an hour long, but you can fast forward and scan through them. Powerful and practical. And there's the link to get the live streams. If you are not currently subscribing to my YouTube channel, Think Like a Nurse, I'm gonna put that link in and subscribe, and you'll get automatically every Facebook Live we do every month, whether you attended live or not. These live forever on the internet for good or for evil. So this is for good, though, by the way. But as you know, things can be on the internet, and we don't always want them to be there. This is a good thing to have on the internet. So anyways, I want to welcome, I've got with me tonight, we're going to have a crucial conversation with Dr. Maria Flores Harris. She is a nurse educator consultant with KeithRN. And Maria, I just want you to just explain your role and how you serve the needs of educators through KeithRN and those that are program members, just to kind of briefly highlight, and how educators who are using our resources can get in touch with you.
Sure. Hi. Hello, everyone. Welcome. As Keith said, I'm the nurse educator consultant for KeithRN. So, what does that mean? That means that I'm here to support you. I support you with implementing the resources that we have into your program, best practices for use of the resources, to answer any questions. I love to sit and brainstorm. Maybe you have a pain point that you're trying to, you know, work through, and you're trying to figure out how to use our resources, or maybe you need a resource. Talk to me about it. Keith, I know, is very open to hearing ideas and hearing about what you need. So I am really here to support you with the use of the KeithRN products. You can contact me. The easiest way and the easiest thing to remember is maria@keithrn.com. That is my email address, maria@keithrn.com. Shoot me an email and I will respond to you. And on my return email, you will have a link so that you can set up a calendar invite with me if you would like. So I look forward to working with you. And let me say this also, if any of you are not using the product, but you're interested in learning more, feel free to reach out to me as well. I'm happy to put you in touch with our salesperson, or I can answer any questions as well. And I think Keith also has the thinklikeanurse.com website there right underneath his picture. And that is a great place for you to go to get more information.
All right. Thanks so much, Maria. So good to have you. It's like you can't do the work that's needed alone, whether you're in academia or even with KeithRN. So I'm so thankful to have you with us, and thank you for all you do. So with that, let's get started on tonight's topic. We're talking about best practices to bridge the academic practice gap. But what I would like to do is let's start with defining our terms. And as we look at the academic practice gap, I looked at numerous articles in the literature, and this is a concise definition that can get us all on the same page. So when we talk about, the academic practice gap, what is it? This is kind of the synthesis of a couple of articles I want to share with you. And this is what it is: the significant and ongoing gap between educational preparation in nursing education and the demands and the realities of current clinical practice. This gap or disconnect is caused by deficits in the knowledge, skills, and clinical decision-making, resulting in nurses being insufficiently prepared to provide safe patient care. But we also need to remember that the academic practice gap doesn't just affect students who then become new nurses. It also affects patient outcomes. And the second half of this definition states this: the consequences of this academic practice gap include increased levels of stress, anxiety, high turnover rates, difficulty transitioning to practice, and decreased quality of patient care that can lead to disastrous patient outcomes. And I think that's really where we need to remember that what happens in nursing education doesn't stay in nursing education. And so as we look at this topic, I'm going to ask an open-ended reflective question to our audience. How long has the academic practice gap been documented in the nursing literature? Now, when I did my dissertation back in 2020, I was on the topic of clinical judgment and using case studies to develop clinical judgment. And in the process of chapter 2 in my lit review and looking at all the literature on clinical judgment, entry-level competency, basically found an article that is the first documented nursing journal article that documented the existence of this disconnect or gap between how nursing is taught and actually practiced. Kim says 30 years. I'm going to say, Kim, let's go up. Anybody else? I'm going to kind of just say, let's keep going. It's not 30 years. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? It's actually a little bit longer, unfortunately. And spoiler alert, we are now in the first article. It says, Dan is saying this, okay, it's not exactly a statement referring to the year. I will say this. This problem has been documented in the nursing literature in Armstrong in 1974, which, if you're doing your math, this is the 50th anniversary of the documentation of the academic practice gap. And as we know, it is nothing to celebrate. And so it's something when you realize this has been going on for 50 years. And when you look at the consequences and everything else related to it, we have got to stop this. We have got to not just stop it, we have to bridge it and be part of the links in the chain to really strengthen how nursing is taught. And that's why I'm so thankful for all of you who are listening to this, because you can be part of that needed change and that solution. And so I just, you know, the thing that, Maria, you were going to ask about KeithRN, and just, I'm going to let you kind of ask the questions. And I just want, as we're going to open up with just kind of laying a foundation of kind of my experience with the gap, but I also want to open it up to educators as well, and your stories and what you can share. So Maria, I'm going to let you ask the questions, and I'm going to answer them as best as I can. How does that sound?
Sure, sure. I will go ahead and ask the first question, but I'm going to go ahead and say to the audience, now that you know how we've defined that academic practice gap, I would love if you guys have any stories relevant to the gap that you've seen, that you've personally witnessed, something that's really made an impact, please drop it in the chat. And as you know, after Keith answers my question, I'm going to be looking at these stories, and maybe we can share some of those. Always interested to hear what you guys have to say as well. So Keith, as we were talking about this course and doing this Facebook Live, it occurred to me that I don't think that we can have a complete story about the course and your passion with the course and all that you've developed without talking about the history of KeithRN and why KeithRN exists. So if you would just start there and give us a little bit of your background, I think that's going to help everyone fill in how passionate you are, or feel how passionate you are about this.
Yeah, well, thanks, Maria. Myself, I entered the nursing profession as an associate degree nurse right out of high school, graduated in 1983. And I've had 36 years of bedside practice. As a nurse, I've never left the bedside. I have really loved patient care and just being at the bedside and valuing that role. And the last 14 years of my practice, I was in the critical care float pool of a large metro hospital here in the Twin Cities, working between ER, ICU, rapid response, and the circulating role. But I realized about 25 years into my clinical practice how much I love to teach and mentor new nurses. And so I got my master's in nursing education, began to mentor and do clinical adjuncts, and loved working with students. Realized that was my jam. I also had a Baylor weekend position. So I was working weekends, 12-hour nights, Friday, Saturday. And as I began to transition into nursing education, begin to realize how much I loved, basically bringing those clinical realities and those principles into my classroom and all that I did. About in my first year, though, of teaching, I was not prepared for something that, I graduated in 83, fast forward to 2008. And here we are talking about NANDA, a 3-part precisely worded diagnostic statement on a care plan that was 8 to 10 pages long. And I'm saying, I didn't say WTF, but I was saying, this is not how I think as a nurse. And I'm an expert nurse. I've got 25 years under my belt. I'm still in practice. I've never left the bedside. And I saw the gap. And I say, why are we teaching nursing in a way that's not relevant to how it's actually practiced? And then I inherited PowerPoints that were dozens of slides, content of things that I haven't seen in practice, but we're teaching it as if they're going to see it every day. And it's like this disconnect. And I realized that I needed to do something about it. And I read in my second year of teaching, this book that is relevant for every nurse educator yet today. It's Educating Nurses, a Call for Radical Transformation by Dr. Patricia Benner. Anybody ever heard of her? I know you all have. And her co-authors, by the way. This was not just her work, but this outlined the Carnegie Foundation's research that we need to not just flip our classrooms or make learning active. We have to radically transform how nursing is taught. And Dr. Benner talked about strategies and ways to do that. And one of those strategies were unfolding case studies, because we need to bring context to our content. We're not just teaching knowledge. This is not just a psychology degree. We're teaching students to be prepared for practice. So we have to bring context to our content. We need to bring clinical and classroom learning together. And we need to emphasize clinical reasoning. And Dr. Benner talked about case studies, unfolding case studies. And I thought, wow, I got stories every night in the ER. When I'm working rapid response and I see a problem, the things that we see in practice are the stories that our students must be exposed to prepare them for practice. And so I wrote case studies based on Dr. Benner's principles. And then Dr. Linda Caputi came across my work at a conference in Minnesota when I was where I attended her session shortly after Educating Nurses was published in 2010. And she invited me to speak. She saw my case studies and says, Keith, this is really good. We have one breakout session left at Elsevier's Faculty Development Conference where I'm a planner. And she invited me. Unknown, passionate, I'm getting tired. And I've got more gray hair in my beard than I've ever had. But I went to Las Vegas, had a full house, had a website. I said, this is like a once in a lifetime opportunity. And I had a website created, and I just, very simple and passionate, and people and the response was overwhelming. I began to create case studies and then additional topics and additional resources, just taking my lens of practice. I'm really nothing special, except that I feel that God's given me a passion and a talent to teach, but I can translate the theoretical. And Dr. Benner is a scholar. She can use a lot of big words that even I have to look up, but I understood where she was going. And I was able to translate her work and make it practical. And that's the inception of KeithRN. I never wanted this, Maria, to be a business, but the need was there. You see, the need was there. And so I just began to create the content that educators needed to make practice practical, to teach the thinking of practice, the clinical reasoning skills of practice, so we can practice, so our graduates are practice ready. And we can get them practice ready. People will say that, oh, practice readiness that's not possible. We got 2 years. The Marines get 6 weeks, and they can get a recruit into battle ready in 6 weeks. We can do it in 2 years. And so we just have to change the way we teach. And I think that's what we need to remember from Dr. Benner's work and the things that I'm sharing. You don't have to change your curriculum. You don't need to go concept-based. You don't need to do anything different except change the way you teach nursing. And that's what we're going to be talking about in some practical ways to do that, Maria.
Well, we'll get back to your story, but I want to bring in a couple of comments that I see here, Keith, that are right in line with what you're speaking about. So Dan and Shannon both have basically said that we don't have enough clinical time for whatever reason. Dan says that
I'll put his up for you.
Okay, there you go. That, we should be more like physicians and have didactic and then a full year of clinical rotation. Shannon basically said that I was looking at her, that clinical opportunities are very limited. And then Dan also went on to say that hospitals don't allow students to do anything anymore. And some hospitals are saying students can't go here, can't go there, can't do this. They can't touch the EMR. So with all of that, though, and because it's a reality, and it's a reality everywhere, we our clinical time is limited. And so do you want to speak to that? And I feel that that's right in line with what you're talking about with bringing clinical into the classroom. We need to start looking at our classrooms very differently.
Yes, and you read my mind, Maria, because what you're absolutely right is that, we have limited clinical experiences, and unfortunately the quality of those experiences going down. But what we have an abundance of is classroom pedagogy. The question is, how are we using our classroom? You see, the bottom line is your students are adult learners. They can read. They can come to class prepared. You can basically bring when Dr. Benner talked about the paradigm shifts, we must implement. This is not optional, by the way. It is optional because we have a free will, but we do it at our own imperil. This was written 14 years ago. And, the practice readiness of graduate nurses, we're still not even close. We're declining in entry-level clinical judgment competency, and the gap is getting bigger. And even next-gen NCLEX, if we're not careful, can exacerbate the practice gap. And we'll talk about that maybe later, Maria, in this presentation. But the bottom line is that we have an abundance of classroom time. We don't have to regurgitate the textbook. We can present concise, practice-informed presentations that emphasize the thinking and the priorities of practice, and then basically begin to implement. Really, we've really lost sight of what medical education, Dan. I love your parallel to medical education. They use a case-based curriculum. Medical education, and before they get to residency, is inherently case-based. It is not about the knowledge. They had 4 years of pre-med. Now it's time to apply that knowledge into real-world patients and case studies. Medical education has been using case studies for decades, longer than nursing education. And so as we focused on conceptual learning and curriculum, we've lost sight of the value of case-based curriculum as a foundation, because a well-written unfolding case study brings in the complexities of practice, a real-world scenario, the thinking skills of practice, and the opportunity to reason through them as you would as if you were in practice. But it's safe, just like simulation. Make some disastrous mistakes and it goes to a code. Okay, just a learning, but they'll never forget it. But a well-written unfolding case study, and that's what I've really been passionate about creating for educators, are the most realistic, that align with practice, unfolding case studies. And there's a free case study on KeithRN.com on the home page. Grab it, as well as the rubric to grade it with your students. So again, you can get a sample there. But the bottom line is, we need to be making learning active, bringing that context to our content, and practicing clinical judgment skills in the classroom. So we really need to reinvent and rethink our classroom teaching, Maria, and you're spot on. That's where we can control it 110%. We don't have to rely on the clinical setting to define it for us and say, oh, they can, because as we know, clinical learning is so variable. Some students get a great patient and they learned a ton, and others got like, oh, they went home 2 hours after I got here, or they went home the night before, and now I've got to get a patient at the last minute that I have no idea what I'm doing. That's the reality. It's very unstructured. It's very ambiguous. But a classroom, a well-written case study, done in small group discussion, you're the guide on the side. You see, we can change the way we teach. And I think that's really what we need to embrace. And Dr. Benner's work gave us the roadmap. And what I've done with KeithRN for 12 years, I didn't think I'd still be on this road 12 years later, but I am. And I'm tired and I'm weary. But you know what? I'm not going to be here forever on this earth. But I want this guide. What I've come up with recently that we'll be publishing in about 2 weeks is a nurse educator guide to develop clinical judgment. And the subtitle is How to Bridge the Education Practice Gap to Prepare Students for Practice, as an online course. It's got over 5 CEs. It's got content that is free. And I'll share with you the link where you can get first in line when that goes live. But this is a course that is really the essence of all the best practices in the nursing literature, the things that I've tried to do to make it simple for the everyday educator. You know, the ivory tower is real in nursing education, unfortunately. And that can sometimes be a barrier for us to really understand. It's like we can talk about the problem. It's time to act. It's time to respond. It's time to improve patient outcomes because patients are dying as a result of failure to rescue. And as a rapid response nurse, one of the things that happened, I didn't share this, Maria, but I just want to briefly share this as an exclamation point. When I went to Las Vegas for the first year, you know, that first time that I spoke at a national event as an unknown educator, a month before that event, I had a rapid response where at 4 a.m, I got a call, rapid response, telefloor. It was med surg actually. And that patient was basically, was a patient who came in with a ruptured appy. Second day post-op, patient was beginning to have signs of decompensation that went unnoticed for 4 hours. And when they called rapid response, when the nurse did that little check, even though there were signs and symptoms present, the nurse didn't interpret them correctly. And the last blood pressure was 140/90. And when I went into the room, the patient was unresponsive, pale, diaphoretic, and cool to the touch. What do you think's happening here? And I said, when was this pressure last checked? And it was 4 hours ago. I said, let's recheck it. And it was 60/30. This patient was in septic shock, went unrecognized, and now this patient was near death. We got them to ICU, intubated, multiple vasopressors. You know the fire drill if you're a critical care nurse. Next day, the patient was dead. And this story is not isolated. Every one of you listening to me, you know of a nurse with a failure to rescue event where a patient had a bad outcome, may not have died, but something life-changing happened because it wasn't recognized until it was too late. And this is where we've got to get off this hobby horse of next gen. Next gen NCLEX and the six steps of this model. It's good stuff. It's a foundation, but it's not about next gen. It's not about the NCLEX. It's about preparing our graduates for practice. And I think that's the culture that we need to that we need to change in nursing education, because I feel that is one of the things that are within our control. You see, there are things like Dan shared. We can't control our clinical sites and the policies they make, Maria, but we can control the culture of our classroom. We can control the culture of our program and our curriculum that is emphasizing the wrong things. You know, the NCLEX isn't bad, but, you know, Maria, you work, give me your insights on this, because I'm kind of a little jaded, but I feel like I'm just tired of this NCLEX Success Conference titles. I've spoken across the country for 12 years. I've been to conferences, regional, national, and the majority of these conferences are always about do this or do that for NCLEX or next gen success. It's almost become a mantra. NCLEX success. It rhymes a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think we all know, including you, Keith, that I think we all know that obviously the NCLEX, if we're preparing students just for NCLEX, we're not preparing them for the real world. That's why we have this gap. That's why we have a lack of clinical judgment. We all know that. Unfortunately, we also know that the primary quality indicator of a nursing program is NCLEX pass rates. So all the focus is on NCLEX pass rates. If NCLEX pass rates are not where the Board of Nursing says they need to be, then your doors will be closed eventually if you don't get them there. So that we understand that that's why there is a focus. What I used to say, because I used to live in that NCLEX world, what I used to say to our partners is, you can teach NCLEX, but you have to teach above and beyond NCLEX to get your students ready for practice. And we all know that, and we all need to focus on that. And I think what we're seeing now, and those of you that are on, feel free to drop in some comments about this. I think I'm beginning to hear people talk more about transition to practice now that NGN is behind us, so to speak. You know, NGN was released almost a year ago. April 1st will be a year, and the sky didn't drop. We're all still alive.
Mhm.
NCLEX pass rates actually went up and continue to stay up. So we can kind of take the pressure off and say NCLEX is NCLEX. We know we're going to get our students prepared for NCLEX, but we're really going to focus on clinical judgment. We're really going to focus on getting them ready for practice. And I feel that coming. I hope you guys, all of you, feel that maybe we're finally making that turn to transition to what we really need to focus on, getting those students ready for practice. And because we see that the gap is widening, and because we're seeing patients die, we're seeing new grads leave nursing. I've shared with you that I've mentored several new grads that within a year to 2 years have been ready to leave nursing. They are done with it. And that's because they weren't ready for the realities of practice. And I've seen Dan say, you know, real, that we've got to get them ready for the realities of practice. Yeah. So, we all understand why there's a focus there, but I hope that we're going to change that focus. And if I can, Keith, I want to get us back to the course and the guide, because it's very relevant to what I'm seeing here. You mentioned students who are, you know, have very different clinical experiences. You know, I've actually had days before where half of my clinical group's patients get discharged, and we're begging, you know, people to find something to do. So that's one issue. You mentioned, you know, some other pain points that we have, and what I wanted to get to is, tell us a little bit more about the actual tools that are in the guide, in the course, because I saw a couple of statements about how faculty really want to incorporate active learning. They're feeling a little bit of resistance from students, and they really want to know how to put it into practice. So tell us a little bit more about the course and how the tools that will be provided and the different strategies that are provided in the course to really help us implement and take some action instead of talking about it. Oh, and I think Keith froze for a moment. Oh, you're back.
Am I back? Can you see me now? Is everything looking good?
Sounds good. Looks good.
All right. Awesome. Awesome. Well, one of the things that I feel is that I have, I've got an inherently just a very busy mind that's always creating, always wanting to look at. When I was practicing as a nurse, what are the things that I can do to help strengthen how I teach? And, one of the things that, when you look at this guide that we've created, it basically addresses the current challenges that we're facing in nursing education. And we're talking about them right now: the academic practice gap, the lack of clinical and judgment skills, and kind of the why, and digging a little deeper. But really what, when you go further into the course, the second part is talking about using clinical reasoning case studies and other active learning strategies to prepare students for practice, and just beginning to look at how can we teach differently in the classroom to strengthen practice readiness. And so I talked, because the classroom, even with Dr. Patricia Benner back in 2010, when that book first came out, the classroom was ground zero. We're doing well in clinical education as a whole in nursing education, according to the Carnegie's research, but the classroom was where we were found lacking. And, I too, as a new educator, I struggle because, we teach the way we were taught. Let's just be honest. And so therefore, many of us, we're just, it's just the classic PowerPoint, passive learning, and doing active learning and teaching it differently is a challenge. And so some of the strategies that we talk about innovating classroom learning are like radical principles, like practical strategies to get students to come to class prepared. Students should not they never come to clinical unprepared, or you send them home. We talk about how you can use innovative activities, a portion of a case study, some practical approaches to having students come to class prepared, like a ticket or pre-class assignment, and making that part of your classroom culture. So I talk about that, Maria. The importance of making time for active learning. Let's just be honest. We can't, I'm a fan of the scrambled classroom, and we talk about that in the guide, where I've spoken around the country, I've shared these strategies, but now we have a course that has video summaries, audio components of the lesson, as well as visuals and links, where I can talk about, and you can read it and reread it, best practice strategies of a scrambled classroom. For example, you should basically always, if you're going to teach let's say you have that 1 hour of classroom content. Okay, we have an hour. Sometimes you have a 2-hour class, a 4-hour class. Some even have a longer than that. But for every hour that you teach, or every hour that is on the clock, 15 minutes, no more than 20, concise, need-to-know lecture. And I talk about the principles of what I call a practice-informed lecture. You see, the textbook isn't your friend when it comes to lecture, because it's too much information. It is structured in a way that isn't the way that it's practiced. And we need to kind of reorganize our classroom lecture. So I'll just kind of give you a couple of principles there. Number one, you always lead with pathophysiology. Your students must understand the pathophysiology of the concept or the body problem that you're teaching in 1 or 2 slides, 1 or 2 minutes, lots of page numbers, so they can read it. You don't have to teach them. You guide your students to the knowledge. So I encourage and I talk about the importance of putting page numbers of the textbook on your slide, but align your content with got to make time. And we spend at least 20 to 30, 20 to 20 to 25 minutes in active learning, whether it be case-based learning or other application strategies, and then having 5 to 10 minutes every hour. Reflect on their learning. Your turn. What did you do well? What could you have done better? How will you apply this to practice? And then taking a 10-minute break every hour. So in essence, I talk about just some practical ways that we can begin to innovate our classroom pedagogy. And so anything else, Maria, that you'd like on that, or just any questions or comments?
No, I think that's good. I wanted some specific examples of some of the approaches that are included in the guide itself. And I think that leads us to the rest of the guide. And of course, we've talked about the problem, we've talked about some strategies, and there's a third part of the guide that really focuses on the KeithRN suite of products. And of course, the majority of those products are unfolding case studies.
Yeah.
And I would really like for you to talk for a few minutes about what a good unfolding case study looks like, because we know they're not created equal. Yeah. And sometimes when people think case studies, they think, oh, I'm going to read a little blurb, answer a few questions, 15 minutes later, I'm done. But that's not what a clinical judgment case study really looks like. So tell us a little bit about that, because for those of you that have the products, you know what you'll get a good description of what you have. If you don't, you want to create your own, be sure that you include some of these strategies that Keith is going to share.
Yeah, and Maria, I might even just take a few minutes just to even share one of the unfolding case studies that I've written. That's even part of the guide. That's a free case study for you to use in your classroom on heart failure as an example. But let me just great question. A case study, let's just kind of step back and say a case study that is going to be meaningful and effective for student learning. Can we just all agree on this principle? It must replicate or simulate clinical practice and how nursing is practiced as closely as possible. So we really want it to be more, a well-written unfolding case study is really a low fidelity simulation. It is simulating practice without the skills lab or the clinical setting. And so let's look at some of these principles, because there's a lot of things that we have been using for decades in nursing education and as relating to case studies, but they're really not simulating practice as effectively as we think they are. Number one, multiple choice questions. Anytime a case study has a multiple choice question, including next gen NCLEX, it is preparing your students to pass a test, not for practice. Why? Do you see my forehead? Your patient's forehead is no different. There is no option A, B, C, or D when you enter that patient's room. It is open-ended, ambiguous, and you either notice what's most important, you don't have any options to select. And so anytime where a workbook has multiple choice questions, it's preparing your students to pass a test, but it's not giving them that discriminatory of replicating the open-ended thinking of practice. So a well-written unfolding case study needs to replicate practice open-ended of practice. And if you look at a lot of they have scenarios, whether they be workbooks or electronic products, but the framework of questions is always different for each different topic. So in essence, it's like this case study topic has this set of questions, some multiple choice. The next case study you do has a whole set of different questions. And when I wrote my case studies 12 years ago, as an unknown everyday educator, just passionate to bring practice to my students in class, I recognized the value of Tanner's clinical judgment model, because it's a practice-informed framework of clinical judgment that identifies 4 distinct processes or steps. What are you noticing? Second step, what's the interpretation or meaning of what you noticed? Third step, responding. What's the nursing priority, the priority intervention? What's your primary priorities? And fourth is the evaluative reflecting. And so when I wrote my case studies, right from the beginning, I used a consistent clinical reasoning framework of Tanner's clinical judgment model with open-ended questions that replicated the thinking of practice. I also have multiple levels of complexity, because your students at a fundamental level are not 4th semester students thinking. So I began to and then had a different in 4th semester, and having an unfolding status where the patient begins here with a scenario, then it unfolds with a new set of data, new vital signs, new assessment data. Then I have integrated audio and audio breath sounds and heart tones, where they can listen to the MP3 and have to interpret the heart tones and breath sounds, for example, of the patient. Again, my goal when I wrote the cases, and they've evolved over the years, Maria, but the bottom line is I've always wanted to say, how can I most closely simulate the thinking of practice with a case-based resource, and helping educators bring practice into their classroom so they can practice.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned with the academic practice gap is failure to rescue. That, we're graduating students who don't have the clinical judgment skills to notice that vital sign or that lab when it begins to go up or down, and interpret what that means, and they fail to rescue the patient before it's too late. Can case studies help with that failure to rescue and building that part of clinical judgment?
The things that we need with One of the things that I've done with Keith that can be purchased in the store, the membership, is that in essence, I always ask this series of questions in the unfolding level, which is, you have a patient, and even the next gen NCLEX doesn't do this very well. You have a problem in an NCLEX NGN case study. It's only 6 questions, but you have that problem. But then every problem that we care for in practice, there can be a complication that develops. And so therefore, every one of my unfolding level case studies, which again is the more advanced level for second year students, ask this series of questions. And you can use these as well. Because these are for you to begin to practice these skills with your students. But the first question is, what complication, what problem, an unexpected problem is most likely, or the worst possible catastrophic. So always think of a surgical patient. They can always go septic. Any surgical invasive procedure, sepsis and septic shock is always got to be on our radar. We've got to be vigilant, looking for it. But then the next question is this is the life signs are the early signs of this complication. Let's say it's, and it could be basically, let's say it's septic shock. Let's say in the OB setting, it's hemorrhagic shock. It's that they're losing blood, they're bleeding. What a neurochanging status, that could be a stroke. What are the early signs? Because this is where a nurse can save a life or they can kill a patient at this question. We must be teaching these early recognition of the most likely or worst possible complications our patients can develop. So being a nurse, an expert nurse, for 25 years before I went into nursing education, and then continued to practice with my Baylor weekend while I was teaching. So I never left the bedside. I've always been connected with a bifocal lens of practice. We have to, I saw in ER and ICU, especially because I'm kind of a cowboy, though I'm a tired cowboy. The bottom line is that those are settings where you have a higher incidence of patient status changing. So you've always got to be vigilant. But even if you're in a nursing home, even if you're in home care, even if you're in this setting, anything can happen. I mean, most times that doesn't happen, Maria, but we've got to prepare our students to be looking for a complication, not just the current problem. You see, even in the NGN cases don't do that. But we have to prepare our students for practice by preparing them for complications that can go wrong, and then of thinking in this type of thinking in the safe, we can save lives, Maria. How we teach nursing. This is where nurse educators have incredible power, because, even though we're discouraged and we're tired and our students can break us down because they're messy, just like we're messy, they can be messier, okay, because they're younger. Got to give them some grace. But the bottom line is that it's hard. But this is where if we teach nursing differently, Maria, and if we are willing to embrace our responsibility, because the path that I'm advocating, let's just be honest, Maria, it's a harder path to teach educational best practices and active learning that students will resist. Can we just be honest? They don't like active learning. They want you to spoon feed them. They want you to tell them what's going to be on the test. And we all know that. Yeah. But an educator who really cares is going to choose the harder path. And that harder path is educational best practices. It's not resisting change. It's being willing to change. And most of us are wired. We don't want to change. Right. Where, we want to stay in our comfort zone. But, this is one of the reasons I think, Maria, if we look at it, why didn't we change 14 years ago? Dr. Benner showed us the path. She showed us the promised land, and we didn't do it. And we have to ask ourselves as a profession in nursing education, why? Yeah. Why didn't we embrace? I mean, I would love the audience to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, why don't you, audience, why don't you drop in some comments if you faced resistance with change. If if you've wanted to focus on something other than NCLEX, you've wanted to flip your classroom, you've wanted to do some innovative things and have met some resistance. Talk to us about that resistance and what kind of feedback you've gotten. I wanted to say a couple of things, Keith. One thing about implementing best practices, it's funny to me that as nurses, we are, and I bet some of you on this call are advanced practitioners as well. We are all about implementing best practices in the practice setting, in the clinical setting. We have to implement best practices. I mean, that it's the standards of care, so we implement best practices in the clinical setting, yet we're okay with not doing that in the classroom. And we should ask ourselves why. I think that's another question to ask ourselves. Why are we so willing to do it in clinical and know that we have to do it in clinical, but we don't hold ourselves quite to that standard of having to do it in the classroom? And then I was going to say that Alan and Crystal both agreed that Alan said that not only is it about assessing change of a condition, but also the skill to realize what big safety issue is at risk when they fail to do or do something. I think he failed to do or not to do something, I'm guessing is what that was. So he's right on board with what you were saying. And Crystal always says, I always tell my students to know the worst case scenario. Those are great comments.
No, and one thing I will say though, Maria, just to highlight your last point that is so insightful and so true, is that educational best practice, academic freedom does not give you as a nurse educator the freedom to reject educational best practices. And so as we look at the importance of active learning and flipping our classrooms to making it engaging with meaningful case-based and other just embrace that. If we know it's harder, we need to embrace the harder path, because our profession and really is we're at a crossroads, Maria. And so we can make a difference. You see, this is where nurses at the bedside make a difference. But I think we need to get recharged and energized a little bit, that we as educators can make an exponential difference, because we have a classroom of 10, 20, 50, 100 students that we can innovate how we teach. Our students are going to be that much more prepared and not be roadkill in practice and leave the profession after 2 years because I didn't sign up for this and they had no idea and we didn't prepare them well.
Right.
So it's our responsibility. We have to embrace our part, Maria, to better prepare our students. And I feel that, one of the barriers that I think that when you look at the why educators struggle to resist change or implement change, we're well intended. I mean, I am for every educator here. I want you to know that I've got your back, and it's been my passion to create resources. But the number one thing that I've heard, Maria, ever since I began KeithRN, to invest, and we don't have the time creating and developing these innovative active learning strategies. And that's really where I just kind of took my mantle and said, you know what, I am going to focus on just creating the best possible tools and resources for nurse educators, the best case studies, the best other application worksheets, and best practice strategies to better prepare our students for practice. So you don't have to create the wheel. You see, and that's really the beauty of the membership, Maria, that you're helping educators and get on board with, is that you've got a curricular solution with over 300 unfolding case studies and a lot of other handouts and even CEs, faculty development webinars that can help you. You don't have to do all the hard work.
Well, we don't have the time to do the hard stuff, right? I'm sure those of you on this webinar would agree. We just don't have time. I hear that every day when I'm speaking to educators. We don't have the time. We are down to our last 5 minutes, and there's really two big things that I want to get to, Keith. One is measuring clinical judgment, and I want you to talk a little bit about how, again, we have some tools where you can measure and quantify clinical judgment. And as you're doing that, those of you in the webinar, please, I would love to hear how you are measuring clinical judgment in your programs right now. What tools are you using for that? And Keith, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, one of the things that, I've had educators ask for years is, Keith, create a rubric for your case studies, because they really help me grade them. And I finally, after I finished my dissertation, and with, recognizing that my case studies, they align with Tanner's clinical judgment model. Every case study aligns with the 4 processes of Tanner's clinical judgment model. Well, guess what other tool does? Lassiter's clinical judgment rubric, used to evaluate high fidelity simulation. So in the last year, Maria, I collaborated with Dr. Kathy Lassiter, the creator of the original Lassiter rubric, and she was a colleague of Chris Tanner's back in Oregon in the Acne Consortium. Case for an unfolding case, 4 processes of Lassiter's rubric. So if you're familiar with Lassiter's rubric, the KeithRN clinical judgment rubric has the same 4 processes, has 11 different individual competencies of clinical reasoning that align with Tanner's framework, that make it possible to quantitatively score how a student, because the case studies that I've written are open-ended, unfolding, so they replicate, you can evaluate the level of proficiency of a clinical judgment of a student, how they respond to the unfolding case study, Maria, and you can quantitatively score it, document it, and a program now has the ability to do a clinical judgment score using a KeithRN case study. And you can do that like every semester and track it if you have a program membership. And that is something that we don't have right now in nursing education. I'm not aware of it. We have Lassiter's rubric for high fidelity sim, but that's a lot of work, because as you know, high fidelity simulation takes a lot of money, time, and faculty effort. You could literally use an unfolding case study and give it to your students and as a proctored exam, and they could fill it out, get their results, score it, and you literally can score your entire program and track it and trend it over time. So that's I'm really excited about that, and we just came out with that.
I'm excited about that. I love to share that. When I say to the educators, you can quantify it, you can put a number on it. That gets me excited and gets educators excited. And Tim did say that his program uses clinical judgment assignments based off of Tanner's clinical judgment model. So that's wonderful, Tim. You guys have a great.
And one of the things that I'll just share in closing here, Maria, as we're wrapping up here, and we'll kind of take some closing comments, but for those of you that would like to learn more about this upcoming course, it is not on the market yet. Hasn't been made public yet. But it will be later this month. So it's coming. And if you don't get KeithRN updates currently, get in the loop with just going to this website, KeithRNHub.com. And that is, just opt in and we'll send you an email. And we have some value discounts coming when that is released for time limited and just about later this month. So be first in line. A portion of this will be free. It'll have 5.4 CEs. It'll be a helpful resource for any educator. And it's really my passion to almost 100 citations and it's all updated. So it's not just about what KeithRN thinks. I'm just kind of like a compiler, like the Drudge Report. I'm compiling all these aggregate sources and putting them into a course or into a single place where we can synthesize and kind of have a clear path that every educator can build upon. Because really it's my passion that I'm not, don't follow me. Follow best practice. And it's my passion to kind of just align, align and to just create that path and then let educators who are creative and gifted to build on it. Use your creativity, use your talents, and have fun again as you implement best practices. It is a harder path, but I can tell you this, I love teaching when I was the guide on the side. And it was more like clinical. I love clinical teaching because you're just you're just guiding knowledge. You're not, being that fountain. That drains you. So we had, so it's actually good for us to teach differently at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
And
I wanted to say we're at time, but if you guys have any questions or comments, please go ahead and drop them in, and we'll be happy to stay and answer. Kim had a question. Is the course included in the membership? If you want to answer that quickly.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kim. You know what? Whether you're an individual member or a program member with your department, the answer is yes. This course is absolutely part of your package. And another reason to consider membership. And so I just put the thinklikeanurse.com, but really, it's my passion to just have educators, implement best practices. And so if you're a member and have access to the resources, I reference a lot of the KeithRN resources in the guide, but there's a lot more there that also are bigger picture than that. So if you're a member, you will this course will be like steroids. It'll just accelerate and really just make it easy for you, much easier to implement. And yes, it is free. So I'm excited to just provide that, because that's always been my end goal, and making that available to you. So yes, it is. And it's my pleasure to do so. I will share this in closing, though. If you're not a member at this time, you know what? I have a 50% coupon. I'll just pop it in the chat. It's just 50 Think. And going to thinklikeanurse.com, I don't have the link, but if you just go to that website, check it out. Go month to month. And you know what? You're not locked in for a year or 10 years. Just check it out. And thinklikeanurse.com, coupon code 50Think. And give it a shot. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised, because it's cost effective, and it's a practical resource, again, to make educational best practices practical. So thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Keith. We appreciate it. Appreciate all of you that joined. This was a great conversation. We may carry it over and do a little more thinking. So keep looking for more information on our Facebook page and on our website.
Awesome. And with that, Maria, is there any other comments or things you'd like to highlight, or are we basically,
I think we're good. We've got people excited that they're program members and are getting this for free.
Perfect. Yes. No, that sounds awesome. And again, and even a portion of this course is free to anybody, Maria. So I want to make it very clear that, a good chunk of this course is no cost. So you know what? I'm not here to spam you. I'm just here to give you value. And check it out for free when it comes live. Get first in line and see what's coming. And let's work together. I would just say in closing, Maria, we can't close the gap alone. KeithRN can't close it. Maria can't close it. But every one of us listening to this, those of you that have heard the need to change, that are willing to do it differently, that recognize that the time is now. And it really is. My goal in this world is that, I feel that God gave me a platform for a purpose. And therefore the patient outcomes and the quality of their lives, that's a big deal. And you know what? Let's link arms. And you know what? Let's do our part to say, 50 years is too long. Let's make this something attainable in our lifetime. Let's not just kick the can down the road like politicians do. Let's own it. Let's deal with it, and let's do the hard work that's needed, and let's do it together. And I would just share, like Ruth in the Old Testament, you are right where you are, or Esther, for such a time as this. So thank you for all that you do to be part of the needed change. It is my pleasure to serve your needs. And Maria, thank you for being a part of our team to help me kind of put some gas in my tank and encourage me on my journey, because I am getting tired. And
I'm happy to be here. Happy to be here.
Awesome. God bless you all. Thanks so much.